and it's being recorded. So you can access the video later if you want to watch it again or share it with other people. And yeah, so let's get started. Our panel today is about biodiversity, and it's about positive futures for nature and humans. And we're really, I think, aiming to give you a hopeful message, but I do want to start with a reality check about the crisis we're facing. And that is that we're losing species faster than ever, 1,000 times faster than any other time in recorded history. And we're actually on track to lose about 1 million species. And these are our cohabitants on this planet. These are lineages of organisms that have struggled and succeeded to adapt to a constantly changing environment for a very long time, over evolutionary time. And suddenly the environment is changing in such big leaps that these long struggling, long succeeding lineages just can't keep up. And so they're starting to disappear. And in their unique place in our living world, they're leaving a hole. And we're going to have 1 million such holes. So this is profoundly tragic. But beyond that, this incredibly species diverse world we've enjoyed until now, it's also been our most important life supporting safety net. And the safety net is breaking down as species disappear. Sir Robert Watson, who is the chair of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or the IPBES, he says we're facing an ominous future. Quote, "The health of ecosystems on which we and all other species depend is deteriorating more rapidly than ever. We are eroding the very foundations of our economies, livelihoods, food security, health, and quality of life worldwide." But this big recent IPBES report that he's referring to, it also tells us that it's not too late to make a difference, but only if we start now and start working at every level from local to global. And so how timely it is that we've all come together to have this really important conversation about what are the challenges we're facing, what are our visions of positive futures, and how are we going to turn things around? What might those transformative changes look like? So I'm really glad to see you all here, and let's dive in. I'm going to introduce our first panelist, Ilona Cater. She is a lecturer in human geography at the Scott Polar Institute in Cambridge and a PhD candidate in Arctic ecology at the University of Durham. She's been doing research on reindeer in Northern Europe. And I'm personally very keen to hear this talk. I've done research on seabirds in Arctic Norway and Iceland, as well as in the Canadian subarctic. And I can say from personal experience that these are some of the fastest changing environments. It feels like you can see the impact of climate change from one year to the next, on everything from the timing of things to the temperature and to the location and movements and breeding success of animals. I'm focused on animals, so I see it in animals. But animals, plants, and people living there are forced to change their ways of life very fast. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Ilona, who will share some of her work on Arctic communities in a changing climate.
Brilliant, thank you so much for the kind introduction. And I'll just see if I can get my screen shared. And is everyone able to see that all right? Excellent, brilliant. So yeah, thank you for the kind introduction. And today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about Arctic communities in a changing climate. So I'm a little bit biased because I do my research there, but the Arctic is an absolutely stunning place. It's this beautiful environment filled with all these fascinating kinds of life. It's kind of on what we consider the edge of our world in terms of, in terms of climate, in terms of, you've got 24-hour daylight in summertime, you've got 24-hour darkness at nighttime. It's really this incredible place. And very often when we look at things like, your David Attenborough documentaries, we see it as this stunning, untouched great wilderness. And there are bits of that image that is true. It is stunning and amazing, but it's not untouched and it's not a wilderness. And the first way that this is the case is because there have been people living within the Arctic for, it's thought, up to 40,000 years in some parts of Siberia. And these people have been living in the region and they've been managing the region and using the region, interacting with the landscape and the animals and using resources in the area. Dr. Victoria Bushman, who's an Inupiat conservation biologist indigenous to Alaska, has said that conservation is about sustainable and respectful use. Inuit are exceedingly good at both of these. So this is maybe a little bit different from the idea we usually have of conservation, where you completely remove the people and you leave nature to do its thing. And in fact, there's been a lot of really interesting research projects around the world that have looked at what happens when Indigenous people are removed from an environment in the name of conservation. And quite often they've actually found that it's detrimental to biodiversity, that these whole ecosystems actually rely on people being there and using it in a respectful and sustainable way and carefully managing it. But it's interesting that often when we look at Indigenous peoples across the world, we have this association of them as being like they were when we met them first as Western cultures. We have this idea that that's what they were like and that they were what we call traditional. But in reality, Indigenous peoples, especially in the Arctic, have always been incredibly dynamic. They've changed throughout history, facing changes in climate, facing changes in society. And they've been incredibly dynamic and adaptable to all of these changes, especially living in an environment that is quite extreme. And so, there's little room for error. So the fact that they've survived there that long is a kind of a testament to their adaptability. However, as Martina pointed out, the Arctic is facing difficulties right now. It used to be that every time I went to an Arctic conference, people would start every single talk by saying the Arctic is warming at twice the rate compared to the rest of the planet. Well, now we know that actually parts of the Arctic are warming at 3 times the rate compared to the rest of the planet. And this has all kinds of impacts both on the humans and the wildlife living there. So for example, it's causing a lot of issues like things like avalanches, natural disasters. In many areas, sea ice is a lot thinner than it used to be, and this is incredibly problematic for the animals which rely on sea ice to migrate across to reach new pastures. And it's also incredibly dangerous to people who have this expectation that the sea ice is strong enough to hold them when they walk or drive across. And unfortunately, many people have passed away in accidents where they've fallen through the sea ice, which is thinner than expected. On top of that, you've got huge impacts to things like infrastructure. So this is a picture of a community in Alaska called Shishmaref. And this is a coastal community that used to be surrounded by sea ice for much of the year. But now that the sea ice has melted, the sea is able to come right up to the shore, and it's eroding the land in far quicker than it used to when the sea ice protected the coast. And so this has caused, large parts of the village to basically be swallowed by the sea. And so the entire community has had to relocate. And we have a lot of these kind of issues with, not only communities, houses and buildings, but also roads, which form vital lifelines for people, being destroyed either with this kind of erosion or with the melting of permafrost. On top of that, a lot of people and animals are being affected in terms of livelihood. So for example, this was a piece of news just from this year when extreme weather events caused widespread falling of rain instead of snow in the middle of winter due to a warm period. And this caused a thick layer of ice to form over the snow. And in this case, it caused potentially tens of thousands of reindeer to starve, which is not only hugely problematic to the animals and to the ecosystem, but also to the people who rely on them, either as a form of livelihood in terms of food or also in terms of materials. And on top of all of that, people within the Arctic, whether Indigenous or non-Indigenous, are experiencing a lot of grief seeing their environment change in such a rapid way, and seeing there's this idea of solastalgia, the idea of sort of almost homesickness, because they're seeing their work, they're not leaving their home, but they're seeing their home almost leave them because it's changing so much. But instead of being victims within all this, it's quite interesting that Arctic peoples, and especially Indigenous Arctic peoples, have been really proactive. So Silawat Cloutier, who's a former president of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, has said, "We're not looking for people to solve our problems. We may be the most vulnerable to all of these monumental changes, but we are still a people of great dignity and pride. We have much to offer in understanding the crisis our climate is in, and in offering solutions. So at this point, you might ask that if Arctic people are so incredibly adaptable and they've adapted all these times in the past, and there seems to be this will and this energy to adapt today, why are they still facing kind of all these issues with such difficulty? And I argue that there's a couple of reasons for that. So for one, Arctic peoples are not only dealing with a changing climate, but they're also dealing with the legacy of a lot of other changes. So this includes things like rapid change in culture coming from colonization, which has involved loss of language and beliefs and spirituality and loss of lands, confusion over identity, kind of the movement from a more subsistence culture to a more capitalist culture. And these are all really different, and there have been a lot of traumas as well involved within those processes of change. So a lot of Indigenous peoples within the Arctic are dealing with all of these changes on top of a changing climate. So for one, their energies are very spread. Another thing is that there's also been a loss of agency. So a lot of Arctic Indigenous peoples have been very clear about the fact that they have some solutions. They have some ideas on how we can preserve the Arctic environment in a way that is good for both wildlife and the people living there. But they don't have the power to influence policy and to kind of make changes in how land is used, especially because the Arctic is such a resource-rich area. And indeed, a scholar, Cameron, has said that climate change itself, as a number of Indigenous leaders and scholars have made clear, is thoroughly tied to colonial practices, both historically and in the present, insofar as greenhouse gas production over the last 2 centuries hinged on the dispossession of Indigenous lands and resources. Now, there are some shifts going on in some of these relationships, especially in terms of agency. So for example, the picture we have on the screen is one of the Arctic Council. And the Arctic Council, within it, it is mandatory to include Indigenous people. So they have 6 Indigenous permanent participants that are representative of the Indigenous groups across the circumpolar Arctic. And it's been really wonderful to see kind of such an official body have that Indigenous inclusion. It's really a wonderful step in the right direction. Although it should be noted that whilst the Indigenous participants have to be included and they have the right to ask questions to the nation states, they don't actually have a vote within the Arctic Council. Also, it's important to note with this that whilst there is some kind of progress towards more Indigenous inclusion, there have been some notable absences in recent large-scale conferences like COP26, where a few people have noted that the inclusion of Indigenous peoples, who are often taking care of many of the important biodiverse regions of the planet, their inclusion has been very low. However, the title of this talk is Imagining a Positive Future for Nature and Climate. So I'm not coming here, personally, all the things I've said so far, I think are not actually negative, but they're a sign of positivity and a sign of hope. Because what this means is we have a group of people who have a lot of knowledge and who have a lot of answers, and they are ready there with the energy and the will, but we just need to create that space where we can work together with them. Here's a whole bunch of kind of things that a lot of Indigenous people from across the Arctic, including the Inuit and the Sami, have been doing for the climate, both in the past sort of decade, but also even with COP26. And as I was saying before, there's really kind of this wonderful sense of energy and desire within these communities to contribute towards looking after our planet. But in order to create this agency, I think many other groups, whether that be academics or those involved with policy, need to create a space of cooperation, consultation, inclusion, and kind of allowing this space for agency to occur. And kind of speaking about the values that are involved in that, it's very closely connected to this idea of unity and diversity when we look forward to the changes that are happening to our planet. Because whilst Indigenous peoples have much knowledge and understanding of the Arctic environment and its changes, they of course don't know everything. So it's very much a case of collaboration goes a long way. And I've just ended with a bit of a twist of a quote saying, the will is there, we just need to let there be a way. And I think that's kind of quite a positive place to look forward to. So I will end my talk there and say thank you very much for having me and giving me the chance to chat with you. And I look forward to Arthur and Lorent's talks too.
Thank you so much, Ilona, for your presentation. If anyone has questions for Ilona, hold on to them. At the end, you'll have an opportunity to write them in the chat. So I'm going to transition us from the chilly Arctic to the hot and steamy tropics with a presentation by Dr. Arthur Dahl. He is the president of the International Environment Forum and a coral reef ecologist who has been witnessing and researching long-term changes on coral reefs for half a century. He has since shifted to spending most of his time building environmental cooperation regionally and internationally. So he's really uniquely well positioned to speak to us about challenges and also signs of hope at the small scale and way out to large scales of organization, both in biological systems and in human society. So I'm very eager to hear what he have to share with us. So without further ado, I hand it over to you, Dr. Dahl.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join in this panel and try to share, might say the warm perspective as opposed to the cold perspective on the dimensions of our planet. And I should probably start with, both, you might say, the good and the bad news in terms of the beauty of the coral reef ecosystem and also the problems that it's been facing. And I'll so share my screen to give you a little bit of the visual dimension while I'm explaining some of the data behind it. So let me just. So, say first, we're looking at this existential threat that coral reefs are facing as one of the ecosystems that's perhaps most in danger on the planet today, in large part because of climate change. What is the coral reef ecosystem? It's an ancient, highly evolved ecosystem, well over 20 million years old, where you can find corals from that time that are recognized as a species we see today. They have rich diversity and are highly productive in a resource-poor environment. The tropical waters are so transparent because they're biological deserts. They've been stripped of almost life by everything trying to grab anything they can find in the water. Coral reefs are dynamic, changing but resilient within limits. They're the world's largest structures built by biological activity, visible from space. Scientists have drilled on some of the atolls in the Pacific and have found more than 1 kilometer of coral reef skeletons before getting down to the volcanic basement. So growing at 1 or 2 millimeters a year, you can imagine how old these are, how long it's taken to build those reefs up to the surface. There are reefs on many tropical coastlines. More than 100 countries and territories have coral reefs. They support at least 25% of marine species and provide safety, coastal protection, well-being, food, and economic security for hundreds of millions of people. 500 million people live within 100 kilometers of reefs. And of course, in these areas, indigenous peoples have learned to live with reefs in balance with them for thousands of years. I can remember you could be going to one village in the Pacific Island where I worked for many years, and they would say, well, we don't take more than we need. We leave the giant clams close to the village in case the weather is bad and we can't go further away. But we only take what we need. We know there's always more. We need to go and find it. So just as in the Arctic, they had a sustainable and respectful use of their reef resources. And of course, the value of the goods and services provided by reefs, fish and many other things, are estimated at $2.7 trillion per year, including 36 billion just in coral reef tourism. So they're also major economic resources for the world today. And of course, coral reefs need light for growth. They're very energy efficient. I mean, corals are animals with plants living inside of them, what we call zooxanthellae. So they simply grow into the light, and the The algae produce food for the corals, and the corals fertilize the algae, and they do very well together. Reef-building corals grow, therefore, in shallow tropical waters to access light. They're highly effective in capturing maximum solar energy, even better than leaves on the land. Ecosystem maximizes total productivity, not just the most productive species. We tend on land to say we'll go for the one most productive thing, but everything works together on our coral reef, and even the least productive parts contribute something more to the whole system. So the system maximizes total productivity, not just the most productive species. And there's rapid energy transfer, efficient energy use, and little waste. The result, of course, is that we have these complex ecosystems with very high coral diversities. You can see here in dynamic balance. They're always changing. A storm can come and smash corals, and they will regenerate and grow back very quickly on an unhealthy environment. And the high efficiency in energy capture means that they can get a very high density of plants and animals on the reef. The result is to get these very complex systems, very much like a city. I mean, look at a coral reef, it's very much like a city today, with and where we build more and more space to make more and more people in the city. The reefs do very much the same thing, allowing for population increase. And the diversity of forms and ecological niches allows for higher overall density. They have high biodiversity as well. On the Great Barrier Reef, for example, there are over 400 species of fish, 4,000 mollusks and other shellfish, 1,500, 400 corals and so on, many kinds of fish. They're an extremely diverse and rich system, one of the richest on the planet. You also find many ways in which the species work together. It's not just an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, the competition. There are all different ways that the different species work together, like this clownfish and an anemone. The clownfish swims around attracting fish to its anemone. They go down to eat it. The anemone paralyzes the big fish, and they share the table scraps. So they have a very efficient way of working together. Another example is the cleaner fish, which attracts large predators to it, where it will swim open its mouth and clean out the parasites on its gills and clean its teeth and so on. It's never eaten by the big fish because the big fish knows it's getting a benefit from the cleaner fish. So you have all these kinds of interspecies collaboration, mutual assistance, everything contributing something to the general well-being of the whole. And they're complementary in all of their diversity. Unfortunately, this is not all good news. It's so beautiful to see that. Those pictures were taken 30, 40, 50 years ago, unfortunately. It's not so much like that today. So much has changed in the last half year. Since the 1970s, there's been very significant decline in coral reef systems due to coastal pollution, overfishing, destructive fishing like the dynamite fishing shown here, and new diseases coming in. For example, this copper coral, which was the main reef builder in the Caribbean 50, 60 years ago, was declared an endangered species about 20 years ago because they'd almost entirely disappeared due to attacks by diseases and warming. So we have all kinds of imbalance. I mean, already by the year 2000, 80% of corals had been lost across the Caribbean. Then you have ecological imbalances. I was swimming across a reef in Samoa 30, 40 years ago, and I saw these crown-of-thorn starfish, but they were not just single ones, there were hundreds of them creeping across the reef, devouring all of the corals. Normally, they're just one of the species keeping corals in balance. But when you get warmer temperatures and additional fertilization from pollution, many more larvae can survive. And 3 years later, you get these masses of starfish out of balance, devouring everything on the reef and killing them off. So there are many different ways in which reefs are being attached today. Then, of course, the major thing from climate change has been what we call coral bleaching. When the water gets too hot for the corals, they expel their algae to try to survive and turn white. If this lasts for too long, then the corals die and the reef is seriously degraded. There was a first major bleaching event from climate change in 1998, and we lost 8% of the corals around the world. There was a partial recovery in 2002, 2010, showing that coral reefs still have some resilience. But now with global warming, repeated high temperature events knock back the reefs before they can fully recover. There were bleaching events again in 2010, 2016, causing a 14% coral loss, replaced by 20% more algae, like some of these shown here. And of course, when the algae cover the reefs, the coral larvae can't settle to grow back again. So the whole balance of the reef is shifted. There's been a prolonged heating on the reefs since 2011 that have prevented coral recovery, encouraging further reef decline. And there's been some reefs originally doing better than others. And now we sort of say, where can we still find a few surviving reefs that maybe in colder waters will avoid the impacts of climate change, and we can try a little more to save them. Of course, there are other impacts, you might say, from our release of greenhouse gases, because corals make their skeletons from calcium carbonate. Carbon dioxide dissolves in the water, and it makes the water more acid. And it becomes then harder for the corals and other marine life to have shells to make their shells. A recent report just published this last month on the global status of coral reefs of the world gives some very sad news. 14% of coral reefs died in the 9-year period between 2009 and 2018. And the last 10 years, algae cover has increased by 20%, a clear sign of reef stress and decline. This is an example of algae overgrowing a reef and smothering all of the corals. Coral reefs across the world are under extreme stress from warming and acidification caused by climate change. Although the rate of extent of coral is severe, there are signs some corals can recover if left undisturbed. So we need immediate and drastic action to reduce CO2 emissions to try to help corals to recover and survive into the future, which is why it's so urgent to take action now. During the last decade, the interval between last bleaching events has been insufficient, so corals will recover. There was a little bit of recovery in 2019, where corals recovery came back about 2%. Unfortunately, they're only monitoring the coverage of coral as a whole. They're not looking at species composition. So we don't know how many species are threatened or may already be extinct because of the enormous impacts on reefs in the last few decades. We need rapid action to reduce the release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, 1/3 of which, of course, dissolves into the ocean, making it acidic. Another third covers the rest of the ecosystem, and then the other third is causing global heating. So if we don't act quickly, we may lose all coral reefs, and most of them, by mid-century at the rate we're going. When species go extinct, they can't be restored or replaced on a human timescale, degrading is of which they play a role. Coral reefs would therefore be the first major ecosystem to be driven to extinction by human activity. This seems to be happening. If we don't change very quickly, this could well happen. So are we destroying the best model for our own future? We're not only losing a resource for our countries and peoples, but a system of great scientific value and interest, of great pleasure and natural beauty for all who have experienced it, and a model for how we can make our own human civilization economy more sustainable in a rapidly changing world. So let me stop sharing, because I think now I've seen the indigenous peoples of the Pacific, where I worked for more than a decade, lived in harmony with their reefs, and they're trying today to come back into balance. And we see the work of the small island developing states, one of the loudest voices for action on climate change, because they're seeing these changes. And of course, when you're living on an island like an atoll built by a coral reef, imagine what's going to happen if this reef stops growing. Your island will not only be drowned by sea level rise, but it will erode away and wash away because the processes building it will have been destroyed. So there are major parts of the earth are threatened, our future, if we don't change things very quickly. So this is, I think, a call of alarm to say, we cannot afford to wait any longer. We're already seeing the loss of major biological resources and spiritual resources. We need to do everything possible to try to protect biodiversity, both for its own interest and as it relates to the problems that the climate change is bringing as well. Thank you very much. I hope I haven't pressed you too much, and we'll look forward to the discussion afterwards.
Thank you so much for your presentation. We've heard a lot about the challenges we're up against, this call for alarm, And we've gone from the ecological imbalances that are impacting humans to corals from the Arctic to tropical waters and marine ecosystems. And so I want to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Laurent Mesbah, who is going to talk to us a bit about some paths forward and hopefully some glimmers of hope and positive futures we can dream and work towards. He is a scientist and with special expertise in plant genetics, actually, but an experience in teaching many broader topics from environmental science to value-based leadership, to botany, to climate change. He also designs, manages, implements, and evaluates projects related to sustainable development. So he's been in the trenches, he's done that hands-on work of building a better world. And so he is going to talk to us about some paths forward, some practical actions, how we can cultivate a vision for a positive future, and including some of the deeper cultural or spiritual shifts that need to happen. So without further ado, I hand it to our last panelist, Dr. Laurent Mesbah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Martina, for the kind presentation. And thank you for the organizers for this really interesting panel discussion. So we've had really beautiful presentations with examples of ecosystems in the Arctic and also coral reefs in the tropics. So we've seen two examples. In fact, I'd like to have a little bit of reflection on the importance of biodiversity for humanity and all the services that these ecosystems provide. So we have heard already examples of in the Arctic how important is the natural environment for the local population, for indigenous people, and we've seen also example in the tropics with coral reefs, where population actually depend on this system. So I'd like to just have it a bit more reflection, general reflection, so that it can help us for the discussion afterwards. My reflection is really based on the statement that the International Environment Forum recently published on biodiversity and the importance for humanity. You can find that statement on the IEF website, and maybe we can provide it here on the link later. But so really the reflection is that we're very fortunate to have an amazing planet Earth, where we have actually life everywhere on the planet, and we've just heard example. It's amazing that life has such a capacity to grow and develop in extreme conditions, and not just in the Arctic, very deep in the oceans, in remote places with very different environments, very different climates around the planet. And evolution actually is amazing by itself. I mean, when we study evolution, we see how creative nature can be in finding ways to adapt to different kind of environment and to change, also adapt to changes. So this diversity also allows for amazing ecosystems. And as Arthur mentioned, with coral reef ecosystem, they're extremely complex. They are highly efficient as a system, but they're really, there's a very interesting principle in the ecosystem is the cooperation, is that actually the system is much stronger than the parts. And we see it in every ecosystem we study. We can see that really these principles of transfer and cooperation and transfer of energy and information within the system. And we humans are part of it. We evolved with this life, and we are the mystery of this life on this planet. Why did we evolve in such a way that we have such a consciousness? We have this capacity to understand all these ecosystems and the whole universe. I mean, we are really have we're able to advance in our understanding to the universe and to these different ecosystems. So these ecosystems have evolved with different climates, and so they have a capacity actually to adapt to changes. And if we look at the these ecosystems, they, as we know, we humans evolved together with them. So that's not a surprise that in all these different ecosystems, we have indigenous population who live with these systems and who really know how to live with it. But on the other hand, so we have all these services that are provided, like healthy food, shelter, and that we take everything we take for granted, that we actually don't account into our economic system. So these fresh air and then clean water and also the food and the fertile soils to grow our food. But they also provide inspiration for the arts and for science. So this ecosystem also give us access to knowledge, to the world of creation, and even to reflect on where this creation comes from. So also this is like the most beautiful book ever we can find is in nature. This is where science and knowledge is there everywhere. And this is also can be used. This is we see it with very young children. This is how they actually learn much more looking at nature rather than opening a book. And so we have this beautiful example we heard today, and there's so many others. And indigenous population have such a deeply rooted understanding of this system, and they have a knowledge which very often is not transmitted in written. This is oral knowledge, so it can be very quickly lost. Some of it has been lost, knowledge of the plants, of the animals, how they can be used, knowledge for food, but also for medicine, and also know how to survive in different kind of environments. This this unfortunately can be lost also if these environments disappear with them. And so I just want to come back a little bit on this principle of diversity and cooperation that the ecosystem offers. So it's actually really a capacity because of the diversity of species, and it creates more opportunity for resilience and for capacity for adapting to changes. And we can see it also in human population. When we are, you can see it in companies. If you have employees who have different capacities, different backgrounds, the company can also benefit from the diversity and then be more effective as a company. And it's true in a society, it's also true as a country. And of course, as humanity, we will benefit much more from our diversity if we want to work together on global challenges. So this principle is really an example also for us. And the good news, maybe with all this bad news, is that ecosystems have a huge capacity to recover, and they can actually restore if we give them the time. And that's also our problem with human society. We don't want to take the time, but the time is needed to restore. And that's another challenge, of course, that we are facing, and we need to reflect on the question also of this time and a different way of thinking, long-term rather than short-term thinking. We have been also, the good news is that at the international level, we have been really working more and more addressing these issues, which are becoming more pressing issues. And it goes back, we can say, since 1972 with the first UN Summit on Environment. And we're very fortunate to have with us here present Dahl, who was actually present on this first international gathering and representing the Baha'i international community. But since then, next year, we will have 50 years of these international gatherings, which include the UN Convention on biodiversity, but also the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And we know that we are right into this gathering at the moment in Glasgow. And all these conventions are creating a framework for action. So we know what needs to be done because it's based on science and very well researched and documented science that tells us what to do in relation to climate change and to biodiversity loss. And as Martina mentioned initially, we have already a huge high rate of extinction, so it's becoming quite serious. And another framework is the Sustainable Development Goals, which are actually including human activities and nature together into all these goals. And we have the goal for life on Earth, life in water, in the ocean. They need to be achieved by 2030. So that means we have only 9 years to go for that. And that's on one hand very promising, because if we do it in 9 years, that will be amazing. But on the other hand, it is extremely challenging given the direction that we are taking. So unfortunately, young people now are very disappointed by looking at these agreements, because it looks good, beautiful on paper, but they become empty promises because these promises are not delivered in reality when we look at the science. And it's true for climate change. It's also a convention, and with the current COP26, we see demonstrations of young people really asking for action more than words. And so this is really a challenge, disappointing for young people. But on the other hand, we have young people are more and more willing to do things and very conscious of this reality. So that's the good news. I mean, there's a trend really in increasing awareness and understanding of the problem, which is quite good in a sense. It helps us to go into action. So my last point will be to really to go more into the discussion about what can be done. And unfortunately, I have more questions than answers, but I really liked very much a comment that was made by Professor Dennis Meadows, who was one of the author of The Limit to Growth, written back in the 70s, where he said, if we want to go into action, young people are asking him what needs to be done. And the answer is not the same for everyone. Actually, we need to find out individually, if we want to look at action at the individual level, what can I do and what do I want to achieve? Because not everyone will do the same thing. So that's the first point. And but we have, of course, general answers, the general questions, which are global issues. How do we actually, this is the main question for the Convention on Climate Change, how do we reduce and stop emission of greenhouse gases? Because without that, we can't achieve, a reduction of the problem of global warming. How do we stop deforestation? How do we actually stop damage on coral reefs? And science provides a lot of answer to this, but the problem is, how do we move into action? And so it's also about attitudes, and it's not just about the science and the technology that we have. It's really about our deep relationship with each other, human being, and our relationship with nature. What are the values behind my relationship with the world of creation, including human beings? Do I have a sense of respect, and do I have really that deep love for the others, for my neighbors, for nature behind this? If I have these deep values inside, that this is going to push me for action. And these deep questions are important also. What is the purpose for us human beings in this life? Why are we here? What do we want? What's the purpose also? Why is the human species part of the creation? Why are we here? Are we here just to use everything and not thinking about future, or do we have another purpose? There has to be something a bit deeper. And important values that we can learn from nature, but we learn also from spiritual teachings, are humility, moderation, respect, and cooperation. These values are actually used within the ecosystem. If you don't have a sense of moderation, then we don't see the sense for limits. And when there's no limits on a limited planet, there's no way it can work. So we have to keep this in mind. And also the other point is about the future of humanity. Our civilization is, we want to have material comforts, and we need material comfort, of course, but we can see that it's not working for everyone. I mean, some of us have material comforts and benefits for the most wealthy country and more wealthy individuals. But even that has its limits, because we can enjoy it, but we know that we can't have it forever. So there's a limit even for the wealthy. And so based on this idea, the Baha'i teachings are telling us the question of balance between science and religion, because between reason and spiritual. And so civilization cannot be only material. So here's a quote I'm going to read. Material civilization is like unto the lamp, while spiritual civilization is the light in that lamp. If the material and spiritual civilization become united, then we will have the light and the lamp together, and the outcome will be perfect. For material civilization is like unto a beautiful body, and spiritual civilization is like unto the spirit of life. If that wondrous spirit of life enters this beautiful body, the body will become a channel for the distribution and development of the perfections of humanity. And about another quote about the civilization, material civilization, the civilization so often vaunted by the learned exponents of arts and sciences will, if allowed to overlap the bounds of moderation, bring great evil upon man. If carried to excess, civilization will prove as prolific a source of evil as it had been of goodness when kept within the restraints of moderation. This was written more than 100 years ago. So really, we can really see that this is what is happening now. More and more people are talking about the importance of values in order to be able to achieve these goals. And that also includes the importance of justice. And many people are talking about climate justice because, of course, the most affected by climate change and consequences of climate change are the poor, the most vulnerable, and not most of the time not those who created, actually, produced the most consuming societies that actually produce all these emissions. So I will end with the last quote. We cannot segregate the human heart from the environment outside us and say that once one of these reformed, everything will be improved. Man is organic with the world. His inner life molds the environment and is itself also deeply affected by it. The one acts upon the other, and every abiding change in the life of man is the result of these mutual reactions. So thank you. I hope this will be helpful for further discussion on especially the question of what can be done. And yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation and for leaving us on such a positive note. And it's a great transition into discussion. So now that all the panelists have presented, I'd like to open it up to questions. So I invite the audience, everyone out there, to type your questions into the chat. And while you do that, I'd like to give the panelists an opportunity to ask each other some questions. So if any of the panelists would like to come off mute and just go for it.
Yes,
I have a question. Oh, go ahead. Yes,
I have one question, which is about adaptation to climate change. And in both cases for Ilona and also for Arthur, in the Arctic Circle, you mentioned, Ilona, you mentioned already the problem with changes that is really affecting the community. Are people able to adapt to these changes? Is there a possibility to adapt? And not just people, but even the ecosystem itself? Or is it already too late? Especially for the Arctic, there can be dramatic changes. And for the same question, actually, also for coral reefs, because I've heard there's also some people working on restoration of ecosystem where you can actually plant corals a bit like gardens, and with some species that are more adapted to a higher temperature, and also would be able to adapt to this change to some extent. If it's, of course, we don't know what the temperature will go up to, but yes.
Thank you, Laurent, for the question. I might jump in first if that's all right, Arthur. Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting question, kind of wondering if they're managing to adapt. And I'd say it's a mixture of yes and no, that there's an incredible amount of innovation going on within the Arctic. It's been really interesting for me I do most of my work with reindeer herders in Northern Europe, and I found it really interesting going up there and speaking to, a very elderly reindeer herder, asking him about how he's adapting. And he's showing me like these fancy GPS apps on his phone that he's using to track where his reindeer are and what's happening with the climate. And there's an incredible uptake and creation of new technologies there that's been really helpful in kind of dealing with some of these changes. So yeah, I think there are certain ways where people are managing to adapt, and I think there's a big desire to adapt. But as I said as well, there's a bit of a difficulty because there have been so many changes in the Arctic at such a fast rate that sometimes people are struggling to bridge the gap between these changes. So for example, with many Arctic communities, one way to adapt to a changing environment in the past was to be nomadic. And so if one area became unusable, you simply move to another one. Whereas now with kind of the societies we've built and which these communities are part of, we live a more settled life, and there's need for things like roads and electricity lines and internet lines and things like that. And there's need for kind of jobs that work within Western economies to have income rather than just kind of roaming the landscape in terms of getting subsistence resources. So there's still some struggles with trying to kind of reconcile those different ways of life because some of the old ways of adapting aren't working. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of really great innovation going on in the region as well, and some really fascinating local projects that are sort of almost experimenting themselves with, well, let's give this a go. Let's see if it works. If it doesn't, let's learn from it and try something else. So yeah, it's definitely a region of great innovation.
Responding from the tropical side of things, I think, of course, part of the problem with the tropical coral islands is the nature of coral reefs being right in shallow waters at the surface. They're so immediately affected by sea level rise. And it's not something you can sort of say, I'm going to stop the sea level from rising. It's happening at a global scale, and therefore it's one of those things that are beyond the reach of local action. I know I think the capital of the Maldives is going to build a giant seawall all around the main city. But of course, they lose their sea view. You're sort of trapped behind these walls. And how long will the walls survive before the water comes over the top and something like that, and suddenly become a soup bowl and bathtub instead? So that there's some things that are much harder to adapt to than others. On the other hand, I've got a longtime friend in Fiji, whom I've known since he was in the Peace Corps 40 years ago, who's done a lot of the early work on, as you say, planting corals back on damaged reefs. And he's developed the techniques quite well. The problem, of course, is that if the problems killing the corals are still there, you can plant them again and again, and they'll still be killed off. So you also need to have some control of what's damaging the reef. You can restore a reef if you remove the threats to it, but it's more difficult again. So he was, I think, working on Christmas Island in Kiribati, where like 97% of the corals were killed off. He found a few surviving corals in some of the passes that were more resistant to the hot water. He took those to plant them out and get them to growing, saying try to replace more heat-resistant corals for the other, but it's not the whole ecosystem, it's just a few. And now they're finding, yes, that you can get some corals and find algae that resist the heat, but more and exchange the algae in the corals to help them grow. But it's still tinkering around the edges of a complex system. It's not the entire system. And we're losing so much of the other parts of the system. It's not easy to see. There's no easy technological fix. On the other hand, in terms of lifestyles and things like that, these places are doing some of those creative things that are being done. The Pacific Islands have been throwing out GDP as a measure of well-being and coming up with totally new measures of this, something I worked for many years ago suggesting to be done. And so, for instance, the National Statistical Office in Vanuatu published a well-being in Vanuatu report a few months ago, in which they weren't looking at GDP, but they actually went to the villages. What's important for you? Well, how do you keep your culture? What are the things that bring you satisfaction? What relationships do you want to keep, and so on? And new indicators reflecting what people really want to keep their cultures, to keep their values, and say, this is our progress, this is how we measure development. It's not with how many cell phones we have or how much money is being spent on consumer goods and things like that. So there's some very creative things being done to rethink the way we develop. And while it won't solve all the problems of climate change, it's already setting an example to the rest of the world. Perhaps we need to get away from this heavy consumer lifestyle and this driving climate change, and find other ways, other kinds of satisfaction that are more important, other values, a better human purpose than what we've seen. So there is creativity coming out of these societies that can give us models for the future.
Thank you both for these answers. I actually had a question that I've been burning to ask that just came out of your interesting presentations. And it came out of Laurent's presentation where you're talking about moderation and the importance of this principle of moderation. And I was just reflecting on, other organisms and, for example, animals. We think, okay, they all function with moderation. In practice, they're moderate, but in reality, they don't really have access to unlimited resources because of the reality of their life. They don't have access to unlimited food, etc. And they can never really indulge in greed like we can. And so I was wondering, is there something that we can learn from Indigenous people? Is there something that they have in their values or principles that could inform us, something in their values or spiritual principles that, embodied that principle of moderation, not in a way where they were constrained, there's some practices that they had nomadism or, the hunter-gatherer lifestyle that just let them live in balance with their environment because populations were small, but now our populations are too big to sustain those practices. And so is there some deeper principle that they practiced? And then on a related question is I just think about, we have these traits that served us really well to survive over evolutionary time, to be successful, like competition and tribalism. But now I feel like they're the biggest obstacles to our cooperation and saving ourselves. And I just wonder if, is there some hack or something where we can, anyway, so if you could speak to those, any of you, I would appreciate it.
Yes, maybe Arthur or Illy, you have examples. You've been working more with the indigenous population. Maybe you can.
Yeah, I could jump in here. I think for me, there's kind of three aspects to it. That on the one hand, generally indigenous populations have lived lifestyles that are very connected with their environment in terms of either being subsistence or kind of low-level agriculture, which means that they've been outside in the environment every day. They've seen in real time what's happening to their food resources and other resources, and so they very directly kind of see the changes that happen. So, for me or you, if we want food, we'll go to a food shop. We don't see what's kind of happening all the way at the field where they're growing the wheat and they're milking the cows and everything like that. And so maybe we have less of this kind of idea of moderation because we're less aware of all the work and the processes that go into kind of creating this, for example, food that we utilize. Whereas there's a far more direct relationship in kind of subsistence societies. So I'd say that's one thing. Another thing I'd say is very much connected to worldview. So I found it very interesting speaking to one reindeer herder who, her and her husband, they have a young family and they have a reindeer herd, but they also have multiple part-time jobs. And so I was asking a bit about, why they were putting so much energy into being reindeer herders when they were actually having to work to earn money to look after this herd. It seemed kind of impractical and stressful to me. But she was saying that hundreds and thousands of years ago, the only reason why the indigenous Sami people of Northern Europe were able to survive in that environment was because reindeer were there and they were able to hunt the reindeer. And so over time, this relationship has changed, that they now herd the reindeer, but they see it as their duty to take care of the creatures that took care of them. And this is a very kind of interesting relationship, because it's not that these animals are cute and we want to keep them because they look cute. It's very practical. They raise these animals to slaughter them and to get resources. But it's very deeply embedded within their culture that there's a reciprocal relationship, and they rely on these animals for their survival. And so they kind of have this responsibility for the animals. The last point I'd share is also, I think, the idea of community is a very interesting one when we look at moderation. And I think there's been very interesting studies from around the planet looking at various different aspects of history that have found that as soon as communities gain an amount of excess resources, then we start to see kind of classism and elitism starting to rise within the community, and things start to become more unequal. And when people kind of have excess, it creates these different gradations of these people are rich and these people are poor, those people have rights and those don't. Whereas in a lot of, at least from my experience, cultures living on kind of the margins where there's not a lot of excess resources, there is incredibly strong values of community. So you go out sometimes on your own or sometimes as a community to get food. And when you bring it back, you share it with the entire community. And it's very much that kind of idea of communalism. So it's really interesting to kind of look at, not only how the Indigenous values kind of gear towards moderation, but how also moderation towards resources can help create that community and that equitable environment. But yeah, I've chatted for a long time now, so I'll pass over to the others.
I've seen similar things in the Pacific, among the indigenous peoples of the Pacific. Of course, in the tropics, you can have abundant resources, but you also can have periods of variation. And so, when you have the long-term perspective, there's a sort of sense, well, we may have abundant resources now, it may not last. There may be a storm may come and wipe things out and so on, and therefore we have to make sure that we leave enough for after. I remember I was visiting in Tonga, and I met an old man who said when he was a boy, he remembered that there were rows of trees crossing the island in various directions. And he thought, they're in rows, they must have been planted. I wonder why they were planted. With modernization, the colonial came in, a lot of the trees were cut down, to make larger fields. And then a big cyclone came through. The only food that survived was the food that was still behind the rows of trees in the right direction. And suddenly, that was the wisdom of the ancestors. They knew that no matter which way a storm came from, with relatively enough food to survive, you could make through the difficult time and get back to things again. But that wisdom had been lost. And you find so much of this, that wisdom of the long-term perspective, that even when there's abundance, you don't indulge on the abundance, or you may have a short ceremony where you appreciate it just for the benefit of sharing, but then you go back to being moderate again. And these are very deep values. And of course, there also is that spiritual connection, as you mentioned. The people in the islands, the land and the sea are part of them. They don't see this as separate from that. And therefore, this is a mutual respect for all of that. You simply don't destroy things that are part of you, part of your spiritual connections. And when you have that much broader worldview of being part of a complex world, and then you have that sense of respect and moderation and humility that comes from that. But also, there was great wisdom. I can remember, in New Caledonia, the traditional agriculture was extremely elaborate. This is a very mountainous island, and they had irrigated terraces where they would bring water over several kilometers of rough terrain. They had no cement, they only had rocks and wood, but they would make hollow trees like canoes to bring water across valleys. And each village had maybe 30 different genetic varieties of the major crop plants. Some would do better in a wet year or a dry year, resist this, that, extremely rich. All this was destroyed when the colonial powers came. One, because they brought large animals, because there were no large animals on the island, and they trampled the earthworks and destroyed the irrigation systems looking for water. And then, of course, crops came in, and the knowledge was lost. And so, part of the challenge is saving enough of that wisdom to say, how do we reestablish that balance? How do we bring back that? And many young people today are going back to those values. They're seeing that the consumer lifestyle is not what they need. They see they had other things that they don't want to lose the other human dimensions of their culture that were more important for them. And they're going back to that. So there's a lot of hope, I think, in the sense that, and we can learn from that. Those of us who come from, the Western cultures can go back and learn from that and acquire those values and bring them back into our own societies as well.
Thank you. Alona, go ahead.
Hey, I wonder if I could jump in on that and ask a question to Arthur, but especially Laurent as well. Based on what Arthur was just saying there, what Laurent was mentioning in his talk, there was a really interesting discussion about this kind of idea of balancing the short term and the long term, and kind of how I guess that's a very tricky question, that many different kind of qualities are needed for short-term action now that's really needed, but also long-term action that's kind of sustainable and lasts. So I wondered if you wanted to comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, I can say a few words. Yeah, I mean, you said it yourself. We need a balance between short term and long term, but there are things that are needed in the short term. If you're a farmer, time for harvest, you have to do it now immediately. You can't say, I'll do it later. It's time for harvest. But if you want to cultivate your land for 10 years, for 20 years, then you should care for the soil and for the water and for the climate, and for keep the seeds for next year. So basically everything is needed. But if we lose completely the vision, the long-term vision, then we are in trouble, because we just think short-term benefit, short-term profit, and unfortunately our current system in societies is based on short-term thinking, because the whole governance system is based on election mandates, which are maybe 5 years, in the best case 10 years, but not even that. And on top of it, leaders are not really concerned about long-term perspectives, also because they look more on their own private interest. So long-term is not just 10 years, it's also future generations. So I think these values have been or are present in traditional societies, but also because the pace of time before the Industrial Revolution, things were much more slower. And we would just accept that you need time to get harvest from the tree, and you plant for your grandchildren, you don't plant the tree for yourself. And this was well known and accepted, and including in Europe, until the Industrial Revolution, where everything becomes faster. And then we come here also with it's related to the question of moderation, and because faster and more. Because of Industrial Revolution, we're allowed to go faster and to get more and more. And we thought it's limitless. We have plenty of fossil fuel. We can just burn and have machines and do as much as we want. And now we understand now that it's not true. We're just reaching our limits. It doesn't work this way. So we need to think long term. But that means also we need to think also about our economic and political systems and governance. I mean, this is maybe Arthur Dahl has been working on this very much, and he published a book recently, so maybe he can mention a bit more about the importance of long-term in relation to governance, and it's also related to individual behavior, of course, because it's all connected. Individual communities, institutions, need to connect to include long-term and short-term, and then we definitely need both.
Well, I think, the people in the islands had the advantage that their limits were very close. If you're living on a very small island, the sense of having limits to respect is so obvious, it's right in front of you. And of course, now we're discovering that our planet is an island. We've reached planetary boundaries, and by overshooting them, and that's where at least we have the science to tell us that. Where it might have been obvious when you were just one little human being in a very large continent, suddenly we're able to see how close those limits are. And of course, one of the things we talked a lot about long and short term, but it's also individual versus collective. The individual benefit versus doing things together as a community. When you're on a very small island, you have to get along with everybody. Nobody could escape, you know. You have to learn to get along, and therefore social relations are important. And you find much more collective set of values, everybody together, and everybody working together, within those smaller societies. We have to bring those values back away from the extreme individualism or materialistic society, which didn't pay attention to limits, and say we also need to bring in those community values. And that's, of course, then where what collective governance do we adapt to those different scales of life? And where on the small islands, the governance was in the village. But there was always in the village, there was one person with the wisdom of growing the yams, and the master fisherman, and so on. And they sort of shared out, the functions in the village. And they had the Talanoa dialogue. We just have, examples, where Fiji brought to the climate change, where when you have a problem, you sit in a circle and tell positive stories and build confidence and consult and find a solution. And so they thought, this is the Pacific Island way of doing it. Let's bring it to the Climate Change Convention. And in fact, I was one of the people who took part in the first dialogues they had in Bonn with the diplomats. They brought me in as one of the outside experts to consult with them to bring that principle from the islands to that level of global governance. And so, I think we could do a lot more to do that in the context of the Climate Change Convention, to build confidence and trust and human relationships to be able to sort through these problems. But of course, it's now as we reach the global level, we also say now we need a global scale of governance to also keep us within those boundaries. And as Lauren mentioned, the Baha'is believe in federated world government and have them over 100 years. And so with two others, we wrote a book, How Do We Fix the United Nations to Work for the 21st Century? What do we need to change for that? And in fact, I wrote a paper for the Climate Governance Commission, which was just put online this morning, on how could we imagine a global environment agency as a body that could actually say, we have to live within the limits of greenhouse gas emissions. The science tells me what is the capacity of the planet. How do we negotiate among ourselves to share equitably the responsibility to stay within those limits? And can we actually make laws to say, you must stay within the limits, and if you don't, there are these penalties because we can't afford to go beyond them. It's all voluntary today. So we need to apply the same principle of governance at the global level we accept at the national level. We have at the global level. That's the only way forward. The voluntary approach, with so much selfishness in the world and so many different actors and corporations just out for profit, it doesn't work without some kind of system of governance to make certain that we don't destroy ourselves and our future.
Thank you so much. I'd like to give us some time to hear some questions from the audience. We have 15 minutes left. So Anna, if you could read some questions. I know some of them we've partially answered. Thank you.
Yes, of course. So first of all, thank you so much, everyone, for such a brilliant panel. The first question relates to the idea that people have lost their connection to nature. What values are needed to reconnect people to the biodiversity around them? So I suppose we've already spoken about the values required to manage our resources, kind of values of restraint and moderation and humility. But I imagine that this question is speaking to more, how do we reconnect to nature and the biodiversity around us?
Yes, I can share a little bit of what I've been doing in education. So we've been working with schools and setting up a school program where the children could be more in nature and basically use nature and the garden as the classroom. So the outdoor classroom, and I think there are more schools who are now doing that. If it's possible, of course, if the school is located which is the case, next to a forest. And so essential value is the love for nature and that deep connection, personal connection. I think that experience, I think every child experienced that at a young age when is in contact with nature. It's just it just happens naturally. But that connection is there from the birth, because we're born, we're part of the evolution. So we're naturally connected with nature, nature. But if we lose that connection, we can lose that connection by growing up in an urban environment and not going outside and staying and be on the screen. And then, of course, then we don't have that connection. So it's a bit harder when you're an adult to reconnect, to recreate that connection that you initially have from birth, I would say. But of course, if you nurture it as a child, then it's there. I mean, there's no doubt that you have these values are connected. In indigenous populations, they've been nurturing that, I would say, de facto, because they live in nature, so they just have to. It's almost like a survival, but at the same time, it's also a connection that is there all the time. But again, with the Industrial Revolution, we disconnected ourselves more and more because of our changing habitat, urban environment. And so we're not connected anymore. We lost that connection. So the value needed, of course, the first one is love. When there is love, then there's connection. But then other values include curiosity, for example, and understanding, and then discovering this was also the strive for humans to discover new places and try to look at how it works. And also children have that naturally. They're very curious, they want to ask and so on. So let's go back to our own curious childhood and just go and connect with that again. And then learn from every culture, because every culture did it in a different way, which is also fascinating. And then an expression of cultures, of traditional cultures, arts, are also inherently very deeply connected with nature. Where you can see music, songs, dance, and other kind of forms of arts. So this is another source of connection with these values that are expressed through the arts.
Of course, if you consider what is our human purpose, is it simply to be well fed, to be well housed, to be comfortable, to be entertained, on the material side of things, or are there other dimensions to human experience that go much deeper? And I think we find that contact with nature, and it's really, you can't just do this through imagination, you really have to go and experience it. When I see, the big tech companies want to create an entirely artificial environment, be totally immersed in an environment they will create for us, how distant that's going to be from anything real, entirely manipulated for their profit. The total other extreme. But I think, as Lauren said, get out into nature, see nature, experience it, and this will grow on you. There have been studies done, patients in hospital. A patient in a hospital who has a window with a tree outside will get better faster than the patient without a tree outside the window. They even tried putting a video screen of a picture of the screen the same size as the window. It didn't have the same effect as actually seeing the real tree outside the window. So there's something about direct contact with nature. It teaches humility. It teaches moderation. It brings out all sorts of spiritual qualities in us if we're looking for that. I mean, Baha'u'llah, the Baha'i faith, actually said, the city is the world of bodies, the country is the world of the soul. And so I think if you accept any kind of a spiritual dimension to human purpose, then we discover that dimension in part through contact with nature, all the qualities reflected in nature, all the beauties reflected in nature, so many attributes of what you might call God or ultimate reality are reflected in the natural world. And so therefore, I think accepting that dimension and cultivating it and making the connection is part of bridging that gap from the artificial world we created and getting back to some reality which we can find in nature and biodiversity.
Thank you so much. I really value those answers, and particularly around nurturing curiosity and spiritualism in reconnecting with nature. So I'm going to move on to the next question from Gillian Bell. So a winner of the recent Earthshot Prize was Coral Vita, which is trying to grow and restore coral reefs. What is the panel's view on such projects? So perhaps this may be one for Arthur to start off with, and then maybe on to the other panelists.
I saw that and I said, yes, it's wonderful that the work is being done. And yes, there are studies that show that you can help corals to adapt. You can find the algae that are resistant to higher temperatures and seed them into the corals and get the corals out and growing. But as I mentioned before, that's only one little fragment of the reef. That's not the whole reef ecosystem. That's just one particular species or a few species on the reef. It may help to, if to rebuild things, but it's not necessarily going to bring back all the diversity that's evolved over millions and millions of years. So it's, it may be a step forward. It may be all that we have left if we don't do anything further. Maybe we can save a few corals, like we save some fish in aquaria or animals in zoos. But we need a much more fundamental change in terms of acidification, because yes, you can find a fast-growing coral, but it may do for the temperature, but will it work with the acid? There are a whole series of problems. So, it's nice to see that there is a little, fragments of hope, but if they're only fragments of hope, and there's much more that needs to be done, and the rate at which things are going is not happening fast enough. So.
Yeah, and I might just jump in here with, I think it's often been used, this metaphor that if you go to the doctor because you're feeling unwell, the doctor will give you medication for your symptom, but they'll try and find out the root cause and fix the root cause, because that's what has the largest overall effect. And so it's wonderful, when these kind of projects exist that sort of fix some of the symptoms of, for example, ocean acidification and global warming and so on, that they definitely have their value. But I think sometimes those are the things that we can get fixated on, and we also need to remember that the most important thing is to kind of fix the root cause of the malady, and that kind of requires a lot more international effort in that direction.
Thank you very much. Wilma's put forward a question here that says, thank you to each panelist for your contributions. We need to decolonize our approaches and stop marginalizing and silencing Indigenous peoples and other local communities who have been protecting our planet for generations. To achieve this, governments must respect, protect, and fully recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples and other local communities to their lands. Could you please share how governments will achieve this goal as a result of this conference in Scotland?
It's hard to predict the future of the conference, but it's only, partway through its first week. And at least the Indigenous voices are much louder here. In fact, if the very opening session on Sunday, the very first day of the conference, the president of the conference invited a young Indigenous woman from the Maori of New Zealand to give the only talk beyond those of the organizers of the conference, because it was so important to hear that voice. So, and I think we've other examples as well where the voice is at least present. The problem, of course, is the balance of power between the voice of Indigenous peoples and the voice of giant corporate interests and economic interests and the banking system and the financial system and their momentum and their short-term interest. And the fact that they're extremely powerful lobbies and buy-off politicians and all the rest of it. Can we do enough, to make the breakthrough? I think I really enjoyed, the wonderful thrill we felt in Paris when the agreement was in 2015, where on the Tuesday of the second week, the little Marshall Islands of all places announced that they had secretly created, over 100 countries that wanted a strong agreement. They started among the island countries, and they got the European Union on board, they got others on board, and created a momentum where they couldn't resist adopting the 1.5 degrees as the ultimate goal. So, and then this is Indigenous people. So, they are having some impact. We'll have to see, in a week and a half, how successful this will be in listening to them and taking that example forward. But it's much more present than it has been before. Let's be hopeful.
Thank you. I just want to double check with Martina that we've still got time for maybe one more question.
Yeah, a short one. Yeah, we have 4 minutes and have one final announcement at the end.
Okay, perfect. So Wilma, I'm afraid I might skip your next question just because you've already put forward a question. And I'll just get a shorter question here. So let's see. So in China, many farmers are aware that the harm of chemicals and pesticides used to crops, but they don't stop using them. Instead, they keep using them, except the food that they themselves eat. The same problems go to the destruction of the land and wildlife, with overuse for fertilizers and chemicals, or shooting the wildlife to sell as long as they can get more money from the resources they can. They can be in touch no matter what values the resources they contain in the long run. So what can be done to deal with the destruction to nature caused by these clear-minded farmers with the money-based life purposes?
Yeah, I might jump in very briefly on that, and I think that very nicely encapsulates the big range of difficulties and changes that not only Indigenous but many different kinds of people around the world are experiencing. That, you know, with Indigenous groups, there are many Indigenous groups who are involved in oil exploration and the felling of forests and things like that, which might seem counterintuitive to the idea of taking care of nature and being these stewards. But we have this difficult thing where there's a lot of knowledge and a lot of values that are present, but there's also this need to have enough money to feed your family and to pay the rent and to have electricity and to buy fuel to drive your car to work. And it's really difficult to kind of, you know, if you need to get those things, using the natural resources in your environment that in a way that might be harmful to the environment in the long run might be the only short-term solution. And this very much links back to what was said earlier about kind of the disparity between wealth and poverty. But I think it also shows that when we're looking forward to kind of finding these solutions, we need to invite these people to the table to have the discussion. I think it can very easily fall into this thing of we look at different people and say, oh, well, they're not doing this or they are doing this. Whereas instead we need to come together and say, well, this is what we all want to do. This is the goal. What obstacles are in everyone's way and how can we make sure that everyone is able to get there? Because I think there's a lot of kind of non-climatically related barriers that are preventing people from kind of having this positive, being able to act on the positive values that they know and the positive knowledge that they know in terms of looking after the sustainability of the environment. I'll pass it on to Lauren and Arthur if there are any more comments.
Well, I think it's the larger system of the materials and economy, which is a whole series of drivers imposing agricultural systems, you know, and managing markets and all the other things. So people are trapped within the system. There's not room to maneuver. So we need fundamental change in the system itself to make it more ecological, you know, to make it more sustainable. That's what the sustainable goals were intended to lay out for us, the directions forward, you know, to go in that direction. But so it's not just saving biodiversity, it's not just stopping climate change. It's saying, how do we design a system that doesn't leave anybody in extreme poverty, that ensures that everybody can find a place, can contribute, can develop their potential, that, you know, and I think that's where, you know, it's the fundamental system change and the kind of values that would drive that new kind of system that is what we need to go forward in the future. That's where the Baha'is have an approach to social transformation. They're going that direction. Many others are working in the same direction, knowing the need. And let's hope that this will begin to win out, maybe building from the bottom up. Communities that actually can talk about these, finding a locus, and then saying, how do we tell these on a larger scale, and laying the foundations for a new and better civilization, hopefully in time to save some biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. I could just listen to you all for hours and I kept forgetting I was moderator because I was so immersed in what you were saying. So I think you really said it all. I don't have any more words. Thank you everyone for joining us. I just want to leave us with a couple announcements. There's 2 more IEF panels of exceedingly high quality. So please join. There's another one today. It starts at 7:30 Glasgow time, I think. So it's an hour and a half from now. And the topic of that is climate change, engineering the future. And then tomorrow is the last panel. It's at 7:30 Glasgow time, so 3:30 Eastern time, et cetera. You can look it up on the website. And the topic of that is strategies for climate resilient communities. So hope to see you there. And thank you to the wonderful panelists and to Anna for moderating and to all of you for joining us. And yeah, hope to see you soon. Have a wonderful afternoon or evening or morning.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you to Martina as well for your excellent moderating.
My pleasure.